How's it going? Thad Brown here with you on the Endgame on Thursday, the final day of April. Playoffs getting hot and heavy in the NHL and NBA. I guess, end of round one. Things are important. Teams are advancing. The Sabres not advancing. We'll talk about that today. The NFL mock draft and consensus board controversy will not go away. I got a ton of thoughts on that. Plus, why did the Bills draft Davidson Igbenogson? Their hand may have been forced. We'll get into that too. And are NASCAR drivers athletes? Joey Logano, some interesting thoughts in an interview I had with him earlier this week. So we'll get to all that and more today on the program. Thanks very much for being with me. Now, let me start with the whole mock draft, consensus draft issue going on. And this is something, look, it comes around every year at this time after the draft. There are all those people out there that will complain about why do you grade drafts, why you got to wait 3 years without understanding, I think, really what draft grades are about. I love draft grades. I think draft grades are great for someone who's involved in the process quite a bit. And they're very much worthwhile if you understand what they are. But the whole draft grade conversation is like the cousin of the consensus board argument that is just continuing to burn as hot as possible this week. So let me lay out a little bit of what we're talking about here. Number one, like I said, I like draft grades. I think draft grades make a lot of sense if you understand what they are. Draft grades are not a crystal ball. I know people believe that's what they are. And at the end of the day, the whole point of the draft is to get players who will be good in the NFL for 3, 4, 5 years to come. And no matter what we think of that player in the draft, how they actually play is the thing that's the most important. I get all that. Draft grades are not trying to project the future. What draft grades are is you take the combination of what we already know about a player, add into the needs of every NFL team, which you can debate a little bit, but we understand the Bills very clearly needed help at linebacker and corner and edge rusher. It's not, you don't need to be a genius or a football savant to understand that. So you combine what we've seen these players do on film in college with what teams need, and then when do they draft that player? How efficiently do they use that draft resource? And you put that all together to create a draft grade. And it is a nice summation if you take it in the aggregate. And as I posted on my Twitter feed earlier this week, I think Renee Brugler is the one who does it, post the listing of 24 different draft grading writers, columnists, sites, whatever, into a nice overview of what the general draft experts thought of each team's draft. Again, this is not saying whether these players are going to work or not. This is saying, based on everything we've seen from the player up until now, what we know about them, maybe a little bit in high school, but mostly obviously their college career, what we've seen on film, and then putting it into the formula of, well, how well does that player address a team's need? And then how early or late was that player drafted, and how good a use of resources was that player? That is a draft grade. I don't understand why people get mad about that. I do actually understand. The reason people are usually mad about draft grades is because their team got a bad one. That's the general reason why people look at draft grades. Oh, it doesn't mean anything. Well, of course it doesn't mean anything. You don't want it to mean anything because people think you did a bad job or a bad job relative to everybody else. If you understand draft grades for what they are very informational because they will tell you, again, a good synopsis of all the work that a lot of these draft experts do from last August until April. All the film they've watched, in many cases, the coaches they've talked to, the players' families they've talked to, the players they've talked to, all that information gets boiled into a grade for how a team did. And again, it's not about saying that this player will or will not be good going down the road. It's about, from what we've seen up until now, here's how good your team did with this year's draft. And again, the class is something that's figured in there as well. There are players that may have gone earlier in different drafts or later that would have maybe inspired a different grade. But in this class, based on who was available, what your team needed, and when they picked a player, this is the grade we give. And it's ridiculous to me at this point when people throw up their arms and say draft grades are stupid, you got to wait 3 years. We're not grading how the player is going to be in the NFL. The grade is how well a team addressed their needs with what we know of the player in college. Now, that's the mock draft or the draft grade debate. The thing that's really taking over draft social media, if there is such a thing, and there definitely is the arguments about the consensus boards. So if you are to understand or to properly explain what the consensus boards are or do, they're very simply kind of what they sound like. You take all of the draft experts that are being counted, and I have no idea whether it's 3 or 30, it's probably closer to 30, where everybody ranks players on their own. And you make an amalgam of all those rankings into one overall assessment of this year's draft class. Ranked 1 through 300 is the general number because there's a little less than 300 picks in the NFL draft every year. And the discussion is that how useful is the consensus board? Because when you hear about, oh, that player was a reach, that player was a steal, almost always those assessments are based on what the consensus board said. It's not what any one draft expert said. It's not Mel Kiper's board or Todd McShay's board or Dane Brugler's board or Thad Brown's board. It's based on the group of everybody, all the experts put together into an average, essentially. And again, I think the people who are mad at consensus boards right now, the people who scoff at consensus boards, I think are primarily the ones who are not doing a good job based on those boards, the ones who are graded poorly based on those boards. Now, the reason NFL people will gripe about consensus boards is that they say a couple things. Number one, they say the consensus experts don't know as much as they do, which in some cases is true. We'll get to that in a minute. But the other reason that consensus boards maybe don't get the same respect as what an NFL team does is because an NFL team will tell you that a consensus board is based on a player in general, but not how they fit on our team. We have a particular scheme, a particular coaching style. We're looking for a particular type of player. And on our board, that player matches what we want better. Even if, and the team won't say this, but I'm going to insert this, even if the general opinion on a player is different. And this is not an unfair criticism by the teams, because for sure, some players fit into different defenses better than others. We've learned that firsthand in Buffalo this year, going from the Sean McDermott defense to the Jim Leonhard defense. There are some guys that probably will work better in a Jim Leonhard defense than will work in a Sean McDermott defense. And we're going to talk about this in a minute. Corner is a great example of that. Max Hairston, with his speed and his ability to close down passing lanes in his zone, is probably a better fit for Sean McDermott's zone-based defense than what we think Jim Leonhard will do with a more attacking press style that probably fits Davidson Igbinosun better. So based on that, Davidson Igbinosun is probably going to be ranked higher on the Bills board than he would be generally, because you're also taking into account what zone teams might think of him, or more to the point, you're not the consensus board is not built on how a guy will fit a scheme. It's just built on how good will this guy be in the NFL. And if Igbinosun is a guy who fits some schemes but not others, he's going to be graded lower than a player that might fit more schemes, even if for the Bills, that player doesn't work as well. So I do get why teams will look at consensus boards and say that doesn't work for us. I mean, no, an NFL team should not be only drafting based on a consensus board anyway. They're there to do their own work. The idea is they know what they're doing, and if they do, then they should be better at drafting than the consensus will be anyway. But it doesn't mean the consensus is irrelevant or should be ignored. Consensus boards, like any analytics tool, is something that can help you out. It's another piece of information. It is not the end all be all of the draft, but it is certainly something that can assist. And this is the latest in what seems to be a long line of the battle between analytics and football guy. Analytics will come in and tell you that they're smarter than you, they've done more math, more research, and they know everything about a particular tool. Whereas football guy will say, I've been in football forever, I trust my eyes, analytics are stupid. And that's the summation of the argument. Most of the time, analytics guy is correct, or at least more correct. And I think this is another case where that's true. The consensus board, again, is not the only view or the only assessment of the draft, but it is a good piece of information from people who may not work for NFL teams, but they are certainly doing the work. And a couple of executives I want to point out here who've been talking about this that really kind of got this conversation, or at least continued the burning of this conversation yesterday, at least in my opinion. Number one, Eric DeCosta, Ravens GM. Ravens universally considered one of the best organizations in football, going back to when Ozzie Newsome was the GM there. Had another good draft this year by just about every account. Eric DeCosta had a great soundbite, which I posted on my X feed, Thad Brown 7. You can watch it last night, about how the Ravens have seen the consensus board impact, or at least relate to actual drafting strategy. And to sum up, DeCosta said that the Ravens do use the consensus board to try and project when a player might actually be picked. Not necessarily what they think the player should be ranked, but if the consensus board maybe has a player they like in the 30s or the 40s, if the consensus board has that player down around 75 or 80, then they may wait around to draft that player based on the consensus board. But DeCosta also said that they have gotten into trouble doing that. They've actually noticed over the last few years that teams will have players graded more similar to their grades than to the consensus board. And he basically said that there have been a couple of guys they've lost because they passed on them where they thought the player should be picked and waited a little bit to try and use a little less draft capital on that player based on the consensus board. And then another team took that player about where they thought it should go. So again, the consensus board is not everything when it comes to the draft, nor should it be considered that. But it also should not be considered irrelevant and laughed at. And of course, there is football guy out there who's ready to laugh at the consensus board. Enter Tony Baselli, Jaguars executive vice president of football, who apparently went on Florida, I'm assuming Jacksonville radio yesterday, and said, I'm going to sum this quote up, why do we, referring to the football staffs of each NFL franchise, why do we watch 1,000+ games? Why do we need to? Because obviously the consensus guys in the basement have all the answers. That's Tony Baselli's super strong put down of the consensus board. First of all, there's so many things that are dumb about this. It's going to take me a little while to unpack it all. Number one, why is watching film in a basement worse than watching film in your office? I've seen the offices of most NFL coaches. They might be big, but they ain't very clean. I mean, guys live in them, right? For some cases, for some length of time. So how much different is that office really than some dude's basement? Regardless, watching film in the basement is just as useful as watching film in your office. It's still the same film. But more to the point, throwing out the whole basement line implies that the consensus board is made up of dummies, which couldn't be further from the truth. These are some of the most respected people when it comes to draft analysis who aren't working for teams. And Dane Brugler, who works at The Athletic, makes something called The Beast. He has a write-up on everybody who is drafted just about every year and a few dozen more. And he isn't just looking at film either, although that's a big part of it. He's also talking to players, talking to coaches, finding out other pieces of information. Look, Dane Brugler may not be smarter than most of the 32 GMs in the NFL, but he's far from a dummy. And that goes for Mel Kiper and everybody else who you follow in terms of their draft opinion, their draft analysis. So to just blanketly put this group of people down as just dudes in a basement couldn't be more dumb. And why is Tony Boselli taking this route? Most people don't think the Jaguars did very well in the draft. The other team that's kind of caught fire with this is the 49ers, because they drafted at the top of round number 2, Deshaun Stribling, I believe is the name of the receiver, that by the consensus board was a ridiculous reach. And you'll see, the John Lynch is laughing at consensus boards. There are writers out there who are super San Francisco homers who will do the same thing. This misses the point that the consensus board is not meant to be the end-all, be-all of a player. Again, a consensus board is there to be a tool. And the other thing we need to remember about the draft process and projecting whether a player will be good is the ridiculous amount of variables that go into whether a college player will make it in the NFL, or evaluating a college player when it comes to their NFL potential. I mean, you think about, it starts with the player's talent, right? But then on top of that, college scheme, college coaching, how many different schools did you go to? How was the transition between those schools? What was the level of competition you played at? And then when you get to the NFL, are you coachable? What kind of intangibles do you have? Are you going to work well in a big city, in a small city? How are you going to be able to handle all the money? How are you going to deal with it when you have agents and family who are talking to you about all your financial situation? How are you going to be able to handle an NFL scheme, adjusting to managing your own time as a professional? What kind of NFL coaching do you get? Do you have a good position coach? How's your head coach? Do you keep your head coach more than 1 year in a row? Do you have different coaches 3-4 times, 3 or 4 different years? And that's just scratching the surface of what goes into whether or not a guy makes it in the NFL. So for anybody to sit there and tell you they know it is lying to your face. Whether you're pro consensus board or you're Tony Boselli, Mr. Executive VP, who's a Hall of Famer. Everybody's trying to take all these variables and boil it into a good decision. And the consensus board can help there. Just the same way as Tony Boselli's experience can help, and the number of scouts he has, and all of those scouts who put in the time to get ready for these players. All of those things can go together and help if you want to bother to use them all. Tony Boselli apparently doesn't want to bother to use the consensus draft board. One of the things that I remember about technology and where we're going as a country and a world, I always think about what somebody in the 1930s or 40s, or what somebody in the 1800s, or what somebody in the 1400s would think of the world we live in now. And there's an axiom when it comes to that stuff, the advancement of technology, that any sufficiently advanced technology will be indistinguishable from magic. In other words, if I went back to George Washington, Revolutionary War general, helped found the United States of America, and showed them my phone, or the camera, or a car, or an airplane, George Washington would probably think some of those things are basically magic. He wouldn't understand how the technology works. It's too advanced for him. He has no idea about how a phone works. Indoor plumbing at that point was a novelty. I might be getting my historical advancements wrong, but regardless, it's too much technology, too much knowledge, too much advancement for George Washington to see it as anything other than a magic tool that I carry around in my pocket. In a similar way, to kind of borrow that from that axiom, any sufficiently complicated probability, I think at this point, is indistinguishable from luck. There are so many variables that go into whether or not a college player can become an NFL success that many people who don't want to dive into all those variables will just throw their hands up and say, it's luck. It's a crapshoot. That's the draft, right? It's a crapshoot. Because there are too many variables for them to comprehend. There are too many things to go into it to feel like the effort is worthwhile to understand whether that player will make it or not. And I would think that most people who do not have a job in the NFL or in media, and even most of the media for that matter, probably don't feel like it's worth their time to go through all those variables. And they're probably right. But it doesn't mean that dismissing draft experts or draft grades or the consensus board is the right reaction to that. There are many people out there who do put the time in, who do understand a good chunk of those variables. And that is what makes up draft grades and the consensus boards. It's not luck why players succeed. It is just a ridiculous amount of variables that all come together to make that happen. And the consensus board is something that can 1,000% help if understood and appreciated properly. And for the people today who are dismissing the consensus board as stupid or something built from nerds who live in a basement, you are leaving out what can be a valuable piece of information. And for everyone who is dismissing draft grades and assessment of reaches and steals today because the consensus board is stupid, what do they know? They don't live in an NFL front office. They don't understand what this team's scheme will do. Yeah, maybe, but they do have a pretty damn good understanding of what the player is going to be and why the player got to where they are right now and why they are likely or not likely to be a success in the NFL. And if the team is right about it, good for them. At the end of the day, that's the only thing that matters. We can argue about Brandon Beane's picks and John Lynch's picks and Jimmy Gladstone with the Jaguars, the GM there, his picks, all the live long day. If they work, they work. If they don't, people get fired. That's how it goes in the NFL. And whether or not that player works is going to be based on a number of things that happen with that player following the draft. But based on everything we know about that player up until now, here's the assessment of that player. And you know what? More often than not, maybe by a little bit, that assessment's going to be correct, or at least in the ballpark of correct. Not all the time. There's 250-something guys who are picked in the draft. Just by the sheer law of large numbers, there's going to be a few outliers at both ends of the spectrum. Guys in the first round who miss, guys in the 5th, 6th, 7th round who hit. It doesn't mean that the overall consensus is a waste of time or stupid or irrelevant. It is helpful, as Eric DaCosta has pointed out. But you have to understand how to use it. And having this amount of technology is still relatively new. I'm sure there will be a number of people out there, football people included, who have a little bit of fear of using the technology. I mean, I know I have not gotten into AI and using that as much as I should have, not because of fear, but because it's new. And it takes time for me to understand new things. I think that's also a part of this too, that NFL teams who have a ridiculously jammed schedule, who have every minute accounted for almost of every week of the year, especially the ones really close to the draft in early April, probably don't have time to go out there and, well, let's see, how can I use the consensus board? They should make the time, but I can understand the idea that the schedule's already packed. So for the Tony Basellis of the world who are just going to laugh the consensus board and say, we know better, maybe, but the consensus board doesn't know nothing. And it should be respected as such, as a tool that can be helpful, not only for all of us out here digesting the draft and trying to understand what our teams did or the teams we covered did, but also for the teams that are trying to make those decisions. And with any analytic, the more you understand about it, the more it's going to be able to help you. Even if the help it provides is for you to say, nope, that's not going to work for me. That's not relevant enough for me. That hasn't proven to be correct often enough. But just by sitting back and laughing at it and saying, we know better because I played in the NFL and I'm going to the Hall of Fame, which are really good credentials, don't get me wrong, you are leaving out an important piece of information that can be helpful and is certainly not irrelevant. All right, speaking of the Bills draft, I referenced Davidson Igbinosun a little bit. We talked a lot about him on Monday. This is, easily the most controversial pick of the Bills draft this year. And I think the place I want to land on it at the end of the day is that when you really look at what the Bills had to choose from in the draft and outside the draft when it comes to free agents, I think the Bills were kind of stuck on drafting Davidson Igbinosun there in round number 2. Number one, if you look at the next 20 or 30 picks after Igbinosun, there's not a whole lot in there that I look at and say, wow, I'd rather have that guy than a corner who can project to be a reasonable starter in the NFL. There's not a defensive tackle or many receivers or a linebacker who I looked at and said, man, I really wish the Bills would have had that guy. There's one scenario I'm going to bring up in a minute. But for the most part, if you're the Bills and you're looking at the available guys, or even if you just want to look at it now, the guys available between pick 62, where Igbinosun was taken, and like pick 112, next 50 guys, there isn't much in there that I think really would have helped the Bills. So when you're sitting at pick 62 or pick 66, which is where the Bills were originally, and thinking, what do we do? Igbinosun probably would rank towards the top of the list, even if he's not a player that knocks your socks off. Simply because there wasn't a whole lot else in the draft that I think would have made a lot of sense. And I don't think the draft is the only part of this too. Because if you're not going to grab Igbinosun or any corner in round number 2, at some point you're going to have to find somebody to play corner on your team, right? There's going to have to be someone who becomes the backup corners to Max Harrison and Christian Benford. We talked about it quite a bit, that if you take Benford and Harrison, especially before the draft, off this team and look at what the Bills have at corner, it's not exactly comforting to look at the depth the Bills have. So there was going to have to be some ad at corner at some point, whether in the draft or otherwise. Well, if you go to what's available in free agency right now, there's not a lot of great options there either. I mean, you have some expensive guys like the L'Jarius Sneeds, the Marshawn Lattimores of the world, who would absolutely be fantastic guys to add to the Bills, but are going to cost way more than the Bills or probably anybody wants to spend when it comes to against their cap in terms of the amount of cap dollars they want to use. And then if you go past those 2 or 3 main guys at the top, the choices after that get slim pretty fast. You got, in terms of younger guys, Jeff Okudah, who's 27, is available. Rasul Douglas is a guy who's out there. Tre'Davious White obviously is still an option for the Bills, and he may come back. Adoree Jackson, who's 31. Nick McLeod, who actually wouldn't be terrible, but there's not a long list of players available at corner right now who fit into the relatively small box of the Bills can afford them and they'd be okay to put on the field as a starter just in case one of the first 2 guys doesn't work out, whether it's by injury or otherwise. So based on the idea that there really isn't a great number 3 option in free agency, and there really wasn't anything else obvious at pick 62, 66, 68, where the Bills were to begin with, I think they were kind of left with, let's just get the corner. We'll handle our need here and we'll move on, even if it's a fairly uninspiring pick. So I can understand it from that point of view, that you don't have a great other choice, whether it be a different player in the draft or someone you need to fill that spot. The Bills were going to have to add a corner no matter what, whether it was in the draft or otherwise. So doing it there, I think Brandon Beane may have felt that was the best option available, even if it isn't jump up and down and do jumping jacks kind of good. And the other thing Brandon Beane said is there was a run on corners, which he's right about, because 3 corners went between picks 48 and 52. Did Brandon Beane panic a little bit? Maybe. Because after Igbinosun went, there were only 3 guys in the entirety of the 3rd round who were corners who were drafted. So and the next corner went 10 picks after Buffalo. If Buffalo had sat where they were originally, assuming that no one else really liked Igbinosun who did not take a corner, Igbinosun probably still would have been there. Now, the Bills lost a 6th round pick to make that trade up. That's no big deal. Especially with all the picks the Bills ended up with, I'm not worried about the trade up one bit. Did Brandon Beane have to do it? Probably not. But you can understand he sees 3 corners go in 5 picks. And that, when you look at the draft board and what was available, was quickly going to become a priority for the Bills. So yeah, go up and get your guy. You traded down 3 times in round 1 to pick up some picks. Go ahead and assure the fact. Because if Igbinosun's not there, I think the choices for the Bills get worse. Now, I will say, there's one scenario that I at least have been able to come up with so far that I like, that would have been better than what the Bills did. And Buffalo easily could have done it with their available draft assets. The Bills could have sat in round 3, so they don't trade up at all. They keep that 6th round pick they traded to move up to 62 to draft Igbinosun. You sit in round 3 and you draft Ted Hurst, the 6'4", 4.4, 40-yard dash, receiver from Georgia State, who's a different receiver than Skylar Bell, don't get me wrong, in a lot of ways, but a guy with ridiculously more upside. I mean, Skylar Bell could be a really good receiver. You never know. And unfortunately, with fourth-round picks, you can always say you never know. They might turn into anything. Skylar Bell doesn't look like a guy who has a huge amount of upside. Ted Hurst, if he hits, is like Randy Moss 2.0. So the upside with Ted Hurst is huge. Now, the downside is probably pretty low with Ted Hurst. Maybe not as low as Skylar Bell. They're similar guys in terms of they come as productive players at lower level colleges. I think Skylar Bell does more things well than Ted Hurst does, even if Ted Hurst's upper level is incredible. So I think Skylar Bell has a better chance to contribute immediately. But if you want upside, just flat out upside, Ted Hurst is a better option than Skylar Bell. So if the Bills take Ted Hurst instead of Davidson Igbinosun, they still need a corner. Well, remember, with the first pick of round 4 that the Bills originally had, the Raiders traded up to take Jermod McCoy. Now, McCoy has top 15 pick upside. This is a guy who has a first-round talent. The problem is he's got knee injuries left and right. The risk there is pretty high. So while the ceiling is certainly higher than Igbinosun, the floor is way lower. But you're not drafting that corner to be a starter right away. At least we don't think so. You're drafting that corner to be a backup and to develop. You could have done that if you're the Bills with Jermod McCoy. And now, instead of Skylar Bell and Davidson Igbinosun, who both have a good chance to play solid roles on the team, could easily have between 200 to 400 snaps this year, contributors on both sides of the ball. You could have had that, or you have that as the Bills. Instead, you could have had Ted Hurst and Jermod McCoy, who have it within the realm to be top 5 players in their position in the NFL. If you told me of those 4 guys that 2 of them were going to be among the best 2 or 3 or 4 players in their position, I'm not picking Davidson Igbinosun or Skylar Bell. I'm picking Ted Hurst and Jermod McCoy. And the Bills could have gotten those 2 players and held on to their 6th-round pick, which isn't hugely important, but that pick ended up being used by the Browns on quarterback Taylon Green from Arkansas, who may never be a great quarterback in the NFL, but he's a ridiculous athlete. So you want to talk about another pick with upside. I'm sorry, Taylon Green. My bad. Taylon Green is the player from Arkansas. The Bills could have also added Taylon Green with that 6th-round pick they traded away. So if you're the Bills or you're a Bills fan, would you rather have Skylar Bell and Davidson Igbinosun, or would you rather have Ted Hurst, Jermod McCoy, and Taylon Green? Because you can easily have choice B. And choice B has so much more upside. Choice B is dripping with guys who could become stars in the NFL. Choice A is what the Bills have a lot. Valuable contributors who can do a few different things, at least in Skylar Bell's case. Guys who have a high floor, but probably not that high a ceiling. Doesn't mean that choice B is right. But if it were me, I would be more excited about this Bills draft if it were Ted Hurst and Jermod McCoy and even Taylon Green, although he's very unlikely as a quarterback on the Bills to be a relevant part of the team. And this is what we're talking about with the big picture of this draft. Even if Davidson Igbinosun makes sense when you look at what the Bills needed, what they had available to them in the draft and in free agency, getting a corner there does fill a need that you're probably not going to fill in free agency and doesn't prevent you from taking a player, at least in the immediate 10 or 15 picks after Igbinosun, that you would have liked better or would have fit better. But it doesn't mean it is a better opportunity to get one of those high-impact players that the Bills have always lacked in the postseason. And while Ted Hurst and Jermod McCoy could easily amount to nothing in the NFL, the upside for both those guys is off the charts. And the Bills so rarely will draft the upside guys. You see it from time to time. And Kyer Elam, I guess, was a good upside guy with the height or the size speed profile. But this team has always seemingly lacked those difference makers in January. And you could have gone home with a couple of guys that have it well within their frame of opportunity to become those impact guys. And instead, the Bills went with the safer and maybe smarter choices in Davidson Igbinosun and Skylar Bell. I think with Bell, certainly a guy of the four guys we're talking about here, Skylar Bell is number one with a bullet when it comes to being a likely contributor for this season. But he doesn't have the upside that Ted Hurst seems to have. He doesn't have the upside that Jermod McCoy seems to have. And the Bills could have had both those guys instead of taking the corner that probably will be at best a nice backup this year and the receiver who should be a solid number 3, but that might be a ceiling. And I know part of this too is if you go this route and you lose out on Jude Bowery and the Bills do still need a tackle. And actually the way the draft fell, there were, I think, 3 tackles who went the next 15 picks. So the Bills could not have waited for pick 125. After the third of those 3 tackles went, the next tackle was like 185 or something like that. So you do have to do some finagling to get up and get that offensive line prospect you need. And the Bills did need a swing tackle. So to make this all work out evenly, there would have had to have been probably a trade up from one of those 4th rounders, a smaller one, to get into a spot where you can grab your tackle anyway because you're taking Jermod McCoy with the pick that became Jude Bowery. But again, it could have just been the 6th round pick that you used to get up and take Davidson Igbinosun easily. So if you want to just talk about would you rather have Davidson Igbinosun and Skylar Bell or Ted Hurst and Jermod McCoy, if it's me, it'd be Hurst and McCoy all day long. Even if I understand easily how Igbinosun and Bell could be the 2 better players. But this is what the Bills do a lot of, or what at least have ended up with a lot of in the Sean McDermott era, is a team full of B-plus guys and just no A's outside of Josh Allen. And this draft just feels like more of the same. All right, let's take a break here. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about the Sabres, where they're at when it comes to going back to Boston for game number 6. And Joey Logano, can NASCAR athletes be the best athletes ever? He made a pretty decent case about it. We'll talk about that after a break. My name is Thad Brown. The cool kids who get drafted early, they call this show, or they call this station Rock 1. You may know it as Rochester First. Either way, this is the Endgame, and we're back right after a break. Thad Brown back here with you. 3, 2, 1. Let's go again. Thad Brown back here with you on the Endgame here on a Thursday. I want to remind you that once again tonight at 8:30, we've got another edition of BKL Nightly. It'll be me, Caleb Carr, Rachel Liber. We're talking about leftover questions after the draft. Could the Bills sell this offseason to their fans if they weren't also firing a coach this year? We'll talk about that and more tonight again at 8:30 right here on Rochester First. Sabres will continue their series with Boston on Friday up in Boston, game number 6, after a 2-1 overtime loss on Tuesday night at home. And look, I think number one for me, I land on, look, the Sabres are going to be fine. I'm not really worried at all about Buffalo coming out of that game 5 loss. Lindy Ruff said for the last 2 days before the game, it was going to be a grind. It was going to be tough. It was going to be the hardest one to win in the series. Boston played well. I think the Sabres played good too. I don't think the Sabres played a poor game at all. I thought they were the better team for the first 25 minutes or so, certainly after the power play. I mean, they had a power play goal and then followed up with another ridiculously dangerous power play that easily could have made it 2-0. And then I think the series may have been over. Jacob Swayman played well enough for Boston in goal, but Buffalo's still really good. I thought Boston did take control of the game a little more middle of the second period around their goal and on. I thought they were the better team in the third. But in overtime, I mean, the Sabres had 3 or 4 golden chances right before Pasternak gets the winner. So that no worries at all, no issues, no concerns coming out of game 5. It's hockey. We've said a couple times, Boston had 100 points this year. This is a pretty good team in their own right. So taking this series to 6 is not a shock, even if Buffalo, again, has not looked very good at home. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I still think the Sabres win this series. I do worry about Buffalo coming back home for a game 7 with a team that's not used to being in the playoffs, certainly does not have a resume of success as a group. If you lose game 6 and you got to come home and now all you're thinking of is we can't blow this. We can't waste this great season and blow a 3-1 lead in round one when we had home ice advantage. So I do think I don't think they need to get game 6, but it'll be way easier if they did, obviously. Still, big picture, I'd be very surprised if this team loses 3 in a row, 2 at home in this playoff series after the way they've played so far. And I think they probably get it done on Friday. Now, the next time you're going to see me talk, the whole series will be done because game 6 is on Friday. Game 7, if it happens, would be on Sunday. We're back on Monday. But sitting here right now, I'd be very surprised if on Monday we're talking about the end of the Sabres season. I do wonder about the situation with the Sabres kind of struggling at home. I know Buffalo fans have been dying for the Sabres to get to the playoffs. And now that they're here, and not only here, but a legitimate Stanley Cup contender, that the enthusiasm, the excitement, the vibe is just off the hook. I mean, people throw around the term that a team is a wagon all the time. I mean, the Sabres aren't just a wagon. They're a wagon careening downhill at 100 miles an hour, and no one minds whatever turns might be in the way. And for good reason. It's been awesome to be a Sabres fan for the last 4 months. And even, for the most part, through these first 5 games in the playoffs. But I do wonder if all that excitement and all that expectation, not necessarily the Sabres have to win or they're a failure, but just that we're in the playoffs and the team's good. Let's not only make the playoffs, let's make some noise in the playoffs. Let's, as a Western New York hockey fan base, let's do something with this. I do wonder if the Sabres themselves are feeling the weight of that expectation, especially when they're at home. You can't help but notice the vibe and the atmosphere and the juice in the building. There's no way the Sabres are ignoring that. Even if they might just say we got to focus on what they're doing. And they talked about, too, about how they can feel the vibe. Certainly after the game they won, game 1, the comeback, everybody talked about how wild it was in that building. But I do wonder if all of that is putting a giant boulder on the backs of the Sabres to live up to that, to produce for that. And it's not wrong for the fans to feel that way. I'm not going to sit here and say fans should dial it back. Fans should feel exactly what they're feeling. Buffalo Sabres fans right now are 1,000% acting exactly as they should following 14 years of playoff drought with the team that they have right now. And it's up to the Sabres to deal with it. I don't think it matters what team you are in the NHL. Anybody who's got high expectations, whether it's Colorado or Carolina or Tampa or Dallas, any of these top elite teams right now, they're all dealing with the expectations of their home fans. And yeah, it's unusual for the Sabres because they had the drought and everybody's hockey crazy in Buffalo right now. And it's probably a little more of a weight to carry when it comes to expectations. That's the deal. That's how it goes in the playoffs. That's how it goes in pro sports. Sabres got to figure it out. But I do think it might be a legitimate explanation for why so far the 3 Sabres games at home have not looked nearly as good as the 2 games in Boston. The good news is that Buffalo took one of those games, the one obviously that they probably shouldn't have taken, down 2-0 with 8 minutes to go. And you think about if they lose that game, now they're down 3-2, you're going to Boston to play for your lives. It's a whole different series. So fortunately for Buffalo, they were able to overcome the issues, at least in game 1, and to put themselves in a spot where they're still in full control of the series, and really will be, even if it gets to game 7, because they'll be at home for game 7. So it's everything, like I said, I think everything is fine, but I do think the Sabres are having a tough time handling the expectations that their fans are putting on them. And rightly so. There's not, again, anything unfair that the fans are doing. I do think it's a big boulder to carry right now. The other thing about the playoffs right now in the NHL is that home teams everywhere are not doing great. Right now, NHL road teams in round number 1 are 19-19. The Sabres are actually one of 3 teams in the playoffs, the 16 who got in, who are unbeaten on the road. It's Buffalo, Carolina, and Colorado. Carolina and Colorado won their series 4-0. So they won 2 at home, won 2 on the road. They were just the better teams. Hey, that's what happens when you get the most points in the conference. You get to play the worst team in the playoffs. So this is how it goes. The last couple years, I will say, it's not ridiculously unusual for road teams to be playing as well as home teams in round 1 of the playoffs. Last 5 years, there were 2 years where it was essentially like this, where it was 50-50 home and road. There were 2 years where the home teams dominated. Last year, for example, it was 32-15 home teams in round number 1. And there's actually 1 year where the road teams dominated. I think it was 23. Road teams were 33-19 in round 1. Point is, for road teams to be succeeding as much as they are right now, it's not ridiculously unusual, but it is notable. And the Sabres are certainly a part of that road success. And like Lindy Ruff has referenced a couple different times, they have been a good road team all year, at least the part of the year when they were unbelievably good. And they've been a good road team in this playoff series. So there's every reason to believe that the Sabres can go to Boston and get a win Friday night and put this series away. It's unfortunate they couldn't finish it at home. You would have had a bit of a rest advantage over whoever comes out of Montreal, Tampa. Now Montreal's up 3-2. And actually, if the Canadiens win Game 6, the Canadiens will have the rest advantage, not only because their game starts a half hour earlier, so you get a few minutes of being off the ice earlier than Buffalo, but Montreal's home on Friday night. So if they win, they get to celebrate and stay there. Buffalo has to take a plane flight home. So Montreal will have a very slight rest advantage going into the next series. But if the Sabres had won Game 5, then they would have multiple days of rest. And I think that's definitely something you want this year, especially for a team that's got a couple injuries. Josh Norris will be back. Noah Ostlund is going to be out for game number 6. Ostlund's been really good, by the way. He's been, especially for a third liner, he's been very helpful. So that will be a blow. Obviously, the Sabres missed him the first couple games already. So they've done the whole we don't have Ostlund in the lineup thing. So I'm not overly concerned. But you do want to get Ostlund back in the series. And if there's ever a point where Ostlund and Josh Norris are healthy at the same time, which one you play will be an interesting decision. It's worked out kind of well for the Sabres that those two guys who are both have played the third line center in the playoffs, only one's been healthy for every game. And they've kind of alternated back and forth on that. I think right now Ostlund's the better player, but it just speaks to how deep and good this Sabres team is that you can run Josh Norris out there when you're missing Ostlund and still, for the most part, not miss a beat. So I think the Sabres, I would predict the Sabres win Game 6. I think it'll be something relatively comfortable, 3-1, 4-1, something like that. And then by the time we're on here again, me and you talking on Monday, we're talking about Buffalo, I think Buffalo, Montreal. I've thought Montreal is the better team for a little while now. Wouldn't stun me if Tampa came back. They're a little more battle-tested, but I think we'll be talking about Buffalo, Montreal in round 2 of the Stanley Cup playoffs on Monday afternoon. Want to go a little off the board here. Not too long ago, Stephen A. Smith, legendary commentator, was doing a show where he was talking about the best athletes of all time. And someone called into the show, I don't know, commented on the show, suggested that Richard Petty, famous NASCAR driver, should be a consideration for the best athlete of all time. Stephen A. Smith absolutely laughed the suggestion off. What are you talking about? His point was that NASCAR drivers are not athletes. Now, no matter what you think about who the greatest athlete of all time is, I guarantee you NASCAR drivers are athletes. And Joey Logano got a question about that during a media session last week before the race. I think NASCAR was in Texas last week. Joey Logano got a question about, no, it was Talladega, before the race about that comment. And Joey Logano, who, if you don't know, is won 37 times in the NASCAR Cup Series, really came onto the scene as a driver when he was real young. He's in his late 30s now. He's been around the block. He's one of the more entrenched stars, probably not the star of the Cup Series right now, but he's up there. And he really kind of shrugged off, laughed off the question or the idea that NASCAR drivers are not athletes, and rightly so. To be a driver in that sport, you have to be in some sort of ridiculous shape to endure what happens on a regular race day. A lot of times these guys are in what's basically a hot box of a vehicle with all kinds of protection that's required to keep them safe. I know that there's a cooling system in there, so I don't think they're sweating profusely the whole time, but it is not by any stretch the most comfortable drive you've ever had. And they need to survive what's 3 hours of operating one of the most powerful vehicles in the world that isn't in the military or some cutting edge technological thing. And actually, to be honest, NASCAR vehicles are pretty dang cutting edge. So they might even fall into that category as well. Either way, to do that well, you have to be an athlete. You have to have an athletic ability that allows you to get in that car and operate at a high level and to survive the heat, the strain, everything that goes into driving that car for 3+ hours, sometimes more. So these guys are absolutely athletes. Now, can they be the greatest athlete of all time? Which was the whole origin of this discussion. Stephen A. Smith didn't get a question from someone who said Richard Petty was a cool athlete, an okay one. Someone suggested Richard Petty was the greatest athlete of all time. Could a NASCAR driver be that? Well, I actually got a chance to talk with Joey Logano this week, and I put that question to him, and I thought he actually had a pretty good answer for it.
The best ones aren't always the most physically able athletes from what I've seen. Some are, sure. But the mentally tough ones, those are the ones that win. And the ones that have both, yeah, those are going to be the greatest of all time, right? But more times than not, we see drivers that have so much speed, can go so fast, but can't put a whole race together or can't show up in the playoffs, right, or in the chase. You see that with other athletes as well in other sports. It's a mental and physical thing that you have to master as an athlete. And to me, that's what kind of makes one and makes the greats.
I think he's got a good point in terms of how the best athletes of all time get to that point. It's not necessarily just the biggest and the strongest and the fastest. I mean, maybe you can win an Olympic gold medal in a lot of events that way. But when it comes to the sports we're going to debate in America, like we're not going to debate sprinters and hurdlers and long jumpers when it comes to the best athletes of all time, fair or unfair. We're going to talk about NBA, NFL, NHL, NASCAR, golf, I guess, would be included in there too. And being able to succeed athletically in the most important games has always been the truest test of the best athlete. I don't know if we'd ever say Tom Brady is the best athlete of all time, but the guy's got so many Super Bowl wins, he's going to be on the short list or the short-ish list. Even if he's not nearly as fast or as strong or as athletic as Michael Jordan or LeBron James or any number, Lawrence Taylor, any number of NFL players. But he did it in the biggest situation way more often than not and way more often than other players. So that's why Tom Brady is going to be in the conversation for the greatest athlete of all time. Michael Jordan, same thing. The only golfer or the only two golfers that we even discuss in this conversation will be Tiger Woods and Jack Nicklaus. Same thing. When it mattered the most, they were able to make it happen. And to be the best athlete of all time, it's not just the physical. You've got to be able to have the mental discipline to continue to have your body activate and perform in the way you want when there's the most pressure, the most scrutiny, and the most eyeballs on you. And in the sport of NASCAR, while there might not be as many eyeballs as there are on many other sports these days, there are still situations where that comes up. The final few laps of the Daytona 500, the playoff chase, the championship race, as Joey Logano said. So the NASCAR drivers who do that the most often, I can see the argument for putting them among the greatest athletes of all time. All that said, the other thing Joey Logano pointed out is that the best of all time have the mental and the physical, right? With NASCAR drivers, very rarely can you tell the differences on the physical side. As he said, there are drivers who can have a lot of speed, but they don't necessarily have the speed because they are ridiculously fast, strong, athletic. Maybe that's what it is. But I think it's hard for the average fan or really anybody to look at driver A and driver B and say that guy is more physically athletic. We can see who's got the best mental stuff because, as Logano said, the guy who wins more races, wins more championships, that's probably the winner. But you don't see the physical stuff. And that's why, with Michael Jordan, you saw the physical. He wasn't just a winner. He also seemed to have an ability to float in the air. LeBron James has been an absolute monster that for the majority of his career just could steamroll over anyone whenever he wanted to. And he's still at 40 whatever doing it now. So at this point, it's not just how good he was in his prime, but the fact that he continues to have that physical ability at an age that we would long consider him to be over the hill or past his prime. Wayne Gretzky, Joe Montana, same guys. You know, even Montana may not be the best example, although the arm talent is there. Gretzky, just the absolute skating and stick skills are something that anyone can see and measure. Whereas it's hard to really put NASCAR drivers in the same boat. So while I think Joey Logano makes an interesting case for why NASCAR drivers could be considered among those great athletes of all time, I think because the physical skills are so hard to perceive, not only just in general when you watch the sport, but when you go from driver to driver, that I think it makes it really hard to put a NASCAR driver on the Mount Rushmore or even a top 10 list of the best athletes of all time. Now, look, they are 100% athletes. Again, and that has changed over the years. I think 30 years ago, 40 years ago, NASCAR drivers could get away with being unathletic. Same thing goes for golfers, too. I think golfers now, to compete in that sport, you need to be athletes. May not have been the case 30 years ago. It is now. You don't have to be the best athlete of all time, but you got to be an athlete. Almost exclusively. I mean, we're not talking about Champions Tour or Senior Tour stuff either. We're talking about the main guys on the PGA Tour. Same thing for NASCAR drivers. 20 years ago, you might have been able to get away with a little less athleticism. Not anymore. The guys who are in the car now are very much athletes. The greatest of all time, I can't get there, but they do at least cross the bar for being athletes. All right, it's going to do it for today. Thank you very much for being with me. Again, we'll be back again on Monday. Talk about whatever the Sabres do over the weekend. Might have a little more NFL stuff, heading more into the offseason. We got rookie minicamp coming up. And speaking of NASCAR, coming to Watkins Glen. Mother's Day weekend, a week from Sunday. So we'll probably have a little bit to say about that as well. Thanks very much for watching here on the Endgame today. Remember, this is called Rock One. I'm Thad Brown, and the news is next. Stay with us right here on Rochester First.
Get the Rochester First streaming app today for everything you love from News 8 On Demand, plus exclusive shows you won't see anywhere else. Search ROC and download for free on Roku, Amazon Fire, and Apple TV.